Joining me now for an exclusive interview is the Prime Minister of Latvia, Krišjānis Kariņš. Prime Minister, first of all, what a pleasure to have you on the program, and welcome to Canada. You are meeting with the Prime Minister. Will there be discussions to change the nature of the NATO and Canadian support to Latvia in the event of a Russian invasion?
Yes, well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. First of all, I want to stress how important and meaningful Canada's investment into European, into NATO, and into Latvian defense is. It's very highly appreciated. It's also very significant. What we see now in Europe is, starting in February 24, the world has changed, and we can see that how the Russian military works. We understand that when they come into a country, that they're coming into Ukraine, it is a story of complete destruction, torture, rapes, deportations. Everything that we read about in history books is still active. And that means that thinking about our own defense, NATO's defense, what we need to do is to make it much more robust. We need to make it permanent, and we need to make it, to change it, say, from a tripwire defense that we know that the Russians have come to an active forward defense that would deter the Russians from ever attempting that move, because they would realize that if they would come, their advances would be stopped from the very outset. This is what we need to do. Our country is now planning to invest 2.5% of our GDP into defense. We're currently spending about 2.2%. So over the coming 3 years, we'll be greatly increasing our own spending, increasing the number of soldiers, the technical and tactical abilities. But we also realize that given the size of our country, it's important to have the NATO presence there, which is very appreciated, the fact that it is there. But we need to make it much more robust so that Putin and all of his military planners understand that the Baltics are simply a no-go.
Okay, Prime Minister, this is really interesting. And obviously the invasion of Ukraine changed whether the assessment of Russian capabilities or not. I just want you to dig down on what this means. The strategic profile of Operation Reassurance and the other NATO countries was Latvia was a tripwire. In the case of Russia, a tripwire meant Russia would be slowed down in an invasion of Europe, but basically Latvia would be ceded. Now you're saying it should be an active forward defense. Tell us what that means to make it permanent and what that would require. Would it require more soldiers? Would Canada be required to put more soldiers, men and women, on the ground for Operation Reassurance?
Well, what we currently have are 10 NATO member states in Latvia, headed by the Canadians, but there are 9 other partners as well. It's a fantastic multinational force, fully integrated into our own national defense system. But currently the defense situation in the Baltics is such, exactly as you said, the tripwire, that if the Russians were to cross the border, they'd be greatly hampered, slowed down, as the country could be reinforced to reconquer potentially lost territory. But we see what reconquered territory means when we look at Ukraine. The territory would be completely destroyed. We know there will be killed, potentially tortured, etc. civilians. This is simply not acceptable. So the presence that we're asking for, and that we're also investing into ourselves, is a robust enough presence that would never be attempted. So moving from a tripwire that we know that they're there to make it so robust that they would never come in, and that means full capabilities. It's not only necessarily the number of soldiers, it's the capabilities that the unit is having. What we're talking about is a division capability in each of the 3 Baltic countries, in Estonia, in Latvia, and in Lithuania. And once military personnel speak of divisions, that entails that there's a full range of defensive capabilities to handle any sort of contingency and to be able to react immediately, not in a day or two, but immediately in case of any incursion.
Prime Minister, you see what the Russians say. They've used as a justification for their illegal invasion of Ukraine that they've been, quote, provoked by NATO's expansionism. Do you think if Canada had more troops, more weaponry, if NATO provided more help to Latvia, this could provoke Russia, quote unquote?
Well, this is a completely false narrative. When we talk of hybrid warfare, when we think about disinformation, this is a classic Russian disinformation saying that, if you defend yourself or prepare to defend yourself, you're provoking me. It's like a rapist saying that a woman is provoking him by saying something or wearing something or walking somewhere. It's a ridiculous argument. Actually, the only provocation could be being perceived as weak by Russia. So if we look at the case of Ukraine, Russia imagined and thought that this would be easy pickings, a 3-day war, the Ukrainians would surrender, they would take Kiev, nothing would be difficult about it. They had a miscalculation because they perceived their enemy or their opponent as weak. And we need to avoid this miscalculation in the Baltics as well. And this is the only potential provocation that is being perceived as weak, which would open the door for Russia to consider this. And that's why we need to continue to strengthen the position. So it's just the opposite. The more that Canada, the more that any NATO country and our own country invests in our defense, the less likelihood of any attack in the future.
You are meeting Prime Minister Trudeau tomorrow ahead of the NATO summit in Spain, as you know. One of the key moments will be Finland and Sweden asking to join NATO. One, do you think they will ask? And how quickly could that happen? Because the impact of that is very significant. How quickly will that happen if they do ask to join?
Well, we're certainly very pleased and hoping that Finland and Sweden would join NATO. We think this would greatly enhance and increase the security situation in the north of Europe around the Baltic Sea. Certainly in our own country, if they were to petition NATO for membership, the very next day, I'm positive our parliament would convene to ratify this process. So from Latvia's side, from all of the Baltics, and I think that from all NATO partners, there would be no impediments opposed, but this is something that we would welcome with open arms.
Right. I just want people to know it would not happen overnight. It would take all countries in the Union to ratify that as part of, rather, all the countries in NATO. You have a very big meeting. Just before I let you go, just with the last 10 seconds, do you have a specific request to the Prime Minister that you will be making tomorrow?
The request, first of all, it's a big thank you is the first, but the second request is simply in the NATO summit, which is coming up in June in Madrid, that as NATO we rethink and retask the forward presence in the Baltics to this active forward presence from tripwire to an active forward presence, so that we never actually have to go to war. It's much cheaper to invest in proper defense than to deal with the consequences if you have not made that investment in time.
And that's it. The appetite for security insurance policy has increased, I think. Latvian Prime Minister Krišjānis Kariņš, I always appreciate having you here. Welcome to Canada. We look forward to your meeting tomorrow, and thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.